Welcome to Geopolitics Demystified. I'm your host, S.L. Canton. Today we have a fantastic guest, Vanessa B. Lee, and she's from the UK, but she's been living in Syria for a while. So she knows a lot about the reality on the ground. She's a writer, journalist, podcaster, and she speaks so much truth that there is a Wikipedia page for her saying bad things about her, saying she's a conspiracy theorist.
Oh God,
That's when
Wikipedia.
that's when you know that she actually speaks a lot of truth.
Oh,
This is going to be a wonderful conversation. Thank you for coming, Vanessa.
oh, you're so welcome. It's really good to talk to you.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your background? It's so fascinating that you're from the UK, but you live in Syria. And even though there's a lot of problems through the fake civil war, and when we were trying to set up the interview, like you said, the electricity is not available through much of the day. So, what made you move to Syria? What made you fall in love with Syria? So, tell us about that.
It's very easy to fall in love with the Middle East in general, but with Syria and Palestine in particular. Of course, it was originally one country. I guess, although I'm from the UK, just very quickly to give some background to why I got so involved in the Middle East. My father was one of the best known Arabists of his era. And in fact, post-Second World War, he was the Middle East advisor to Ernest Bevin in the British government then. And between him and Bevin and a number of other colleagues, they attempted to prevent the Zionist settlement project in Palestine. And of course, as a result, they came under attack by the Ergun and Stern gangs, the terrorist Israeli gangs. And that really was the last window of opportunity to actually prevent the Zionist colonialist project. And so I kind of grew up in this environment as a kid. My dad was a special peace envoy to Egypt during the 1967 war. He had been there previously during the Suez crisis. And had always been perceived as a friend of the region, but particularly of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the then president, who of course was very focused on Pan-Arabism, just as later Gaddafi would be focused on Pan-Africanism. And my father was one of the few Brits that Nasser trusted.
Wow.
And so I kind of grew up in this environment. I'm not saying it, I guess I absorbed it by some weird symbiosis because I took it to a completely different track for most of my life. But in 2012, my father died in 2001, and I started to go through some of his diaries and his confidential papers and so on. And in 2012, I had the opportunity to go to Gaza. I had a couple of failed attempts because for people to understand, the Egyptian Rafah border is not actually controlled by Egypt. It's controlled by the Zionists. And therefore, if your name is blacklisted, and of course, my father's name, this is conjecture on my part, but my father was hated by the Zionist regime. And so when my name came up, I was spun, even though I had all the papers from the Egyptian authorities and even from the British authorities to give me insurance to go into Gaza. So eventually I entered through the tunnels about 3 days before the 2012 Israeli aggression. So I witnessed firsthand the Zionist oppression and siege and blockade of Gaza and the collective punishment of the Gazan people, even back in 2012, which was mild compared to the last 9 months, of course, and even 2014, which was also a horrendous aggression. And so I guess really it was very much a personal path for me. I guess originally
So one question, Vanessa.
Yeah.
So when you went in 2012, Were you there during the bombing?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, because
Right.
one, I'd entered through the tunnels. So according to Egypt, I was not inside Gaza. So I was effectively inside Gaza without any visa or any paperwork. So it was impossible to leave except by the tunnels. And the tunnels, of course, were being heavily bombed by the Zionists during that particular aggression. But added to that, of course, I went and that's what I wanted to say. I originally went into this as an activist, and then it sort of developed into the journalism because, in a sense, the most effective activism in these kind of situations is to report what you see. Because, of course, what I see is not going to be reported by Western media that is always confirming its own bias, whether it's to their own regime's foreign policy or, of course, to the Zionist foreign policy or policy towards Palestinians, which is intrinsically intertwined with Western foreign policy. That's also very clear. So when you become aware of the fact that what you're seeing is simply being lied about or misreported or reported with omission, and that the voices of those people that are literally being bombed and murdered and shot and just killed summarily, executed summarily, are not being heard in the West. They're not being understood, and they're not being transmitted honestly. And in reality, most of their voices are being completely erased and disappeared in favor of the biases that Western media is upholding. And so it's very easy to go from activism to journalism. And once you get into the journalism, you can't unsee what you see. And so then it becomes really a path of conscience. I can't turn my back on what I've seen, on what I've experienced, because that would be a betrayal of what I've seen and what I've experienced. And the people that are actually living through and enduring the immense suffering that's being imposed upon them by the neocolonialist regimes in the West and their allies in the region, of course, in the Gulf states, in Israel, and further afield.
Wow, wow. So when you went to Gaza, did you stay there for a few days, or what was it
Yeah,
like?
I stayed for, I think that aggression lasted 8 or 9 days. I can't remember accurately. And then actually I went back in 2013 to try and establish a couple of projects to help the kids in Gaza to overcome their trauma, which induced symptoms of ADHD, autism, and so on. Because what people need to understand, I mean, to a degree, they've witnessed an intensity of violence in the last 9 months that, one, it's hard to watch. Two, it's been so intense, 24/7 slaughter and massacres and torment, abuse, rape, torture. I mean, it's just off the scale. But what people maybe don't understand is when these aggressions finish, the violence doesn't finish. Almost on a daily basis, the fishermen are being fired upon. Their fishing zones are always being curtailed anyway. But every morning at 5 a.m. onwards, you can hear the naval vessels firing on the fishermen or capturing them, taking them to prison in the occupied territories. You can have summary executions in the street in front of you at any moment. The Israeli drones that are permanently in the sky and permanently this awful noise that you're probably hearing on the various videos that you've seen out of Gaza, this constant hum, buzz that just drives you crazy when you're living in it 24/7. Any one of those drones at any point can execute someone in the street. I mean, I remember being in a meeting one time and we heard an explosion out in the street during supposed peacetime And one of the drones had just obliterated a young hospital porter going to his work at the local hospital on the basis he's Hamas. And none of these executions are ever reported, ever investigated, ever prosecuted. Israel is never held accountable for them. The day I arrived in Gaza, there was a 13-year-old boy, Hamid Abu Daga, who was playing football outside his house after school. The Zionist helicopters had led an incursion into Gazan territory with Israeli tanks, and they machine gunned the boys and killed Hamid Abu Daga on the doorstep of his house.
My God.
You know, this is, I mean, Eva Bartlett, another colleague of mine who's spent much more time than I have in the occupied, I've never been to the occupied territories, but also in Gaza. She was there in 2008-9 for the Kars-led aggression. She was with me in 2012. You know, it's very hard to describe the daily brutality, even when it's not officially an aggression. It's the sonic booms. The planes will break the sound barrier to create the sound of an explosion, to keep the children particularly in a constant state of trauma and PTSD. There's a million things that Israel does to ensure the collective torture of the Palestinians inside, you know, the kill box that is Gaza, basically.
Wow. And the Israelis, they control all the food, the water, the electricity, and all of that.
The internet, everything, telephone lines. I mean, they also, I don't know if you've been following the amount of surveillance that has been established on the kind of Israeli-built borders around, or fences and walls around Gaza, including automatic machine gun turrets that I saw for myself, where, for example, in the north, they had these automatic gun turrets when I was there in 2013, and I went on a protest with locals to the wall there, and they told me that the distance at which, like if a kid crosses the line, for example, at 5 meters, the gun is programmed to open fire, so that kid will be killed. But the thing is, they change that distance on a regular basis. So one day it can be 5 meters, another day it can be 10 meters, 20 meters, 1 meter. So the locals never know at what point the gun is going to be triggered to actually eliminate them, basically. And you know, yeah, it's absolute hell. And I mean, that's without what's happened in the last 9 months, which has just, you know, I still have contact with some friends in Gaza that, of course, I made back in 2012, 2013. But I'm losing touch with many of them. I don't know if they're still alive. I don't know where they are. The hell that they're now living through is unimaginable for most people. You know,
so, what keeps the people of Gaza going, and what makes them wake up in the morning?
Partly, I don't think they have any choice. You know, it's not like for us, even here in Syria, it's difficult to leave Syria, but it's possible. We're not in like I said, an extermination camp from which there is no escape. The Rafah border with Egypt has been closed since October the 7th, and even before then. Egypt is completely enslaved, in debt to the IMF, to the US, to the EU, to the Saudi, to the Gulf states, to Saudi Arabia, UAE, to Jordan, and to Israel. You know, under the Sisi presidency, ties have been deepening with Israel on an economic, military level. I mean, in 2024, the exports to Israel were the highest they've ever been from Egypt. So despite the genocide, and mafia cartel bosses that are like Ibrahim al-Ajani, who's linked directly to Sisi, the president, and to his son Mahmoud, And he is in control, basically, of the Sinai and of that Egyptian Rafah crossing. And he's basically been charging Palestinians for adults 5,000 to get out of Gaza, and for children 2,500. Before the genocide, it was 500 and 250 for kids. So this is complete profiteering of human misery and suffering.
Dollars?
Dollars. Yeah, dollars. Mm-hmm. So there's no escape. That's number one. There's no way out, right? And this is another thing that a lot of people don't understand. I think people assume there has to be a level of hate on both sides. But I can genuinely tell people there's no hate among Palestinians. There's a desire for justice. There's a desire for reparations and for the restoration of their homeland, and for the ability of the 7 million odd refugees outside Palestine to be able to come back to their homeland, because of course they're not allowed to. Although anyone who converts to Judaism is immediately given citizenship inside Israel, which is another, incredible injustice against the indigenous peoples. Palestinians don't hate. They endure, and they have this innate sense of justice and belief in their cause, right? The problem is from little babies, they grow up in these conditions of apartheid and oppression and aggression and imprisonment, torture, detention, bombardment. It's just endless. What are those babies who've lived through the last 9 months and somehow survived? How are they going to react as they grow up? Of course they're going to want to resist. Of course they're going to want to change this paradigm into something that offers them peace and justice. But the Zionists are indoctrinated with hate. They're indoctrinated with hate and with racism and with an ideological supremacism and ethno-supremacism from kindergarten upwards. So the hatred is also on one side, right? Not only the aggression and the disproportionate force.
Yeah, as I've seen photos of the Israelis sitting on a hill and were drinking beer and cheering the bombing of Gaza. And then I've seen videos. I think it was, Abby Martin. She went to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, and she just walks around the street and she talks to people who are just coming out of the restaurants and bars. And they're like, yeah, we have to kill all the Arabs. They just say it so casually,
Because the Arabs are completely dehumanized. It's a policy. It was a policy of the Nazis. It's also a policy of the Zionists that anyone, they are lesser human beings. They're vermin. They've been described as such. I think even in the early days of the most recent genocide, there were more than 500 genocidal statements issued by military security forces, government members, etc., settlers. It's extraordinary. And as I said, this is an indoctrination that begins at birth. Even Zionists in diaspora, they go on these trips described as birthright trips. So again, it's just programmed into them that this is their birthright. This is their homeland, even though it was stolen. And that theft was enabled by the British Empire from, the early 1900s onwards. Yeah, in 1917. And then, of course, it's been adopted by the US as their kind of military outpost in the Middle East, and their ability to interfere in affairs in the Middle East also. That's very important. And also as a sort of an obstacle to the development of the global south and the Belt and Road Initiative, the growth of Russia and China and Iran in the region. Israel is absolutely pivotal to US foreign policy in the region.
Wow. Okay. So now let's move to your story about Syria. When did you go there first? And did you know when you went there that the Syrian war was fake? What did you know about Syria beforehand?
Well, interestingly, I probably picked up on what was going on in Syria from inside Gaza because, and a lot of people might not be aware of this, but actually the Palestinian movement and Hamas in particular, being the Muslim Brotherhood, were weaponized against Syria.
Yeah.
And so when I was in Gaza and I was speaking with high-level Hamas political wing members, because there is a big differentiation between the political wing that definitely betrayed Syria with the backing of Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Not only Syria, they also betrayed Hezbollah and Iran, the axis of resistance. And there was a couple of instances, I think in April 2013, Israel bombed Damascus. And at that time, it looked very much like a sort of tactical nuke. It was a massive mushroom ball explosion. And so I interviewed a spokesperson from Hamas that was very close to Ismail Haniyeh. And I remember him saying to me, yeah, but Damascus crossed Israel's red line. They were supplying weapons to Hezbollah. And I didn't know what to say. So at that point, I'm like, okay, there's something really wrong going on here. And of course, we started to look into the US weapons flowing into Syria, the training of terrorist groups inside Turkey and Jordan. At that point, Ali Hashem, a journalist at Al Jazeera, left Al Jazeera because he wasn't allowed to report on the terrorists coming in from Jordan and from the north. So he left in disgust. And so there were, it wasn't very sure for us, but we definitely had I say we because Eva was with me at the time. And actually, she then established the Syria Solidarity Movement, and we got together a group of people who sort of investigated what was going on, and we pretty quickly came to the conclusion that this was another regime change war. And historically, if you go back and look at the kind of past 75 years of CIA and MI6 interference in Syria, it becomes even clearer when you look at the intelligence documents from the United States, the email from Jake Sullivan to Hillary Clinton in 2012, sort of basically saying, Al-Qaeda is on our side
in Syria.
As it was, of course. Yeah, go on.
That email was sent one day right after the announcement of the Al-Qaeda. So on February something, the Al-Qaeda, they released a statement for the public saying that we are going to go into Syria to fight Assad. And I think either the same day, within a few hours, or the very next day, Jake Sullivan, he sent an email to Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. And there were released documents from the CIA actually detailing how they would use Islamist insurgents, as of course they had previously in Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood had been weaponized on two other occasions, but most notably in the late 70s against President Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad. So I guess really the first time I tried to go in 2015, and I went the first time in July 2016 as part of a US peace delegation. And during this delegation, we met with the president, we met with members of parliament, members of the opposition.
Wow, so you got to meet President Assad?
Yes, we had a 2-hour meeting with him, which was fascinating.
So what is he like?
He's quite extraordinary. Like very informal, no airs and graces, very open. I mean, very unlike any politicians that we have in the West that are a complete disaster. I mean, they're just script reading, so if you take them off script, they don't know what to say to you. Absolutely the opposite. Completely open to any questions, even difficult questions from some of my colleagues. Very open, no hesitation before he spoke. Visionary, and very humble, very, very humble. I mean, throughout the war, they didn't live in some kind of luxurious, safe environment. They lived in their apartment in the center of Damascus, even when ISIS was, I think, less than a couple of kilometers away from their apartment. They stayed there. The kids continued to go to school every day. Even when the bombing was pretty intense from the terrorist groups that were encamped in the suburbs of Damascus.
So, by the way, I mean,
yeah.
So I have watched some videos on social media and stuff, and President Assad and his wife would just drive the car without, he would be in the driver's seat. The president of a nation driving a small car around like a regular
He's famous
traffic,
for this, actually.
And they would just stop by a mall, and without it, I mean, there must be some security guards, but you can't really see them in the video.
And no, apparently he often does if he can't sleep. I've been told he does just get in his car and go for a drive around the city, and he doesn't inform his security. So when he arrives at the checkpoint, they're like, "Oh my God!" And yeah, he does just go and drive. I mean, I don't know if you remember, but in 2021, myself and Eva were here for the elections, and immediately after the elections, he went to get takeaway in Medan, which is a Damascus suburb, which is one of the most crowded areas. And one of the most simple areas, a lot of markets, a lot of takeaway stores and things like that. And him and his entire family completely kind of surrounded by people, without any security, pushing people back. You never see that with him. On every single trip, you will see him just walking completely unsurrounded. But the security are there, but he doesn't allow them to, in the West, you'll see Macron, for example, the security completely around him because he's hated. But every time Assad goes out, he's just mobbed by people, and
he also has a very nice family, it seems,
Yeah, I mean, very humble. Again, very
kids,
humble.
Yeah, so like he goes to see, to visit wounded soldiers. And the kids would go with him, and they would sit and they would listen to the soldiers.
Yeah, and as I said, having met him for those 2 hours, that humility comes across in that kind of closed meeting also. Very intelligent, very aware. I mean,
so he used to be like
eye doctor
in the UK.
He was an eye surgeon. So because he wasn't intended to be president, it was his older brother Basil who was killed in a car crash in 2000, and so Bashar kind of got elevated to the presidency. And what is also really interesting, pre-2009, which is when really everything started to fall apart, and it became clear really that the West was going to wage a regime change war against Bashar al-Assad because he just wouldn't comply with Western diktats. He wasn't, he basically shot them all down because.
So what were the demands? What were the
they weren't really
demands?
Yeah, they weren't really demands. I mean, if you go back to post 9/11 and pre the invasion of Iraq, and you look at the communications between Tony Blair and Bush, you'll see that they were talking about, let's try and make a different relationship with Syria. In other words, let's try and bring Syria on board, right? And so to a degree, they were courting him during this time. You'll remember
like
John Kerry having dinner with him.
And the French, they gave him like the best award, like the
exactly.
the Legion of Honor award.
Yeah. And Tony Blair wanted to give him a knighthood. He recommended him for a knighthood and so on. So they were courting him. But the problem is that President Assad has huge integrity. So the main points were that they wanted him to accept the Qatari pipeline, which was backed by the US and the UK and the EU, in favor against the Russian-backed Iranian pipeline. Well, that was number one refusal. I think it was in 2009 that President Assad sent the Emir of Qatar packing, basically, and said, no, I'm not doing it. He wouldn't relinquish Hezbollah because, of course, Hezbollah has military inside Syria. It has since 1948, the Nakba in Palestine, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were ethnically cleansed by the Zionist settler colonialist project. He wouldn't abandon Palestine. He wouldn't abandon Russia or China or Iran, specifically Iran. And he maintained his principles. You know, Syria was punished for actually condemning the US-UK war against Iraq, which we know, of course, was pre-planned. This wasn't something that just kind of organically grew out of nothing or grew out of 9/11. And so Assad basically didn't comply with their demands. So gradually sanctions started to be imposed. One, I think, first of all, on the basis that they were supporting terrorists because they were harboring the PKK, the Kurdish separatists in the northeast. Funnily enough, now, of course, the US is actually partnering the PKK.
Now they are the freedom fighters.
Yeah, it's been rebranded as the kind of, Rojava Democrats and the autonomous region and whatever. I mean, the rebranding is just ridiculous. The same with Al Qaeda. And so from 2009 onwards, it became very clear. In 2006, there was a Time magazine article, Syria in Bush's crosshairs. In 2005, Christiane Amanpour, the awful Amanpour of CNN, interviewed President Assad and talked about regime change in Syria. And Roland Dumas, the then foreign minister in France, in 2013, he admitted that the British had come to him in 2009 and told him they were planning a military insurgence in Syria and that they wanted France on board with that, etc. So, it's very clear at what point Assad made it very clear that he wasn't going to comply with the Western foreign policy agendas in the region. And so therefore there was no alternative but regime change. And that's why, the entire so-called peaceful revolution began in 2011.
So, can you briefly walk us through the orchestration of the fake civil war? Because the mainstream narrative is, of course, Assad is a dictator, and all the people just rose up against him because they wanted democracy. And then America and everybody said, oh my God, we have to help democracy. And then, but can you debunk that in like 5 minutes or 10 minutes summary?
Well, I mean, I've talked about the lead up to the regime change war and the funding, sponsoring and arming of insurgents. Many of which came from Libya, were trained in Turkey, and then entered Syria from there. The US had used the same excuse in Iraq, that Al Qaeda was in Iraq. The then villain was al-Zarqawi. And that enabled them to basically increase their military footprint on Iraqi territory. And then, of course, those terrorists crossed the border into Syria. The same from Jordan. Jordan was also instrumental in allowing the armed groups to receive weapons and funding and so on from the south. And the reality was that President Assad in the early days, and everyone talks about the brutal crackdown, but for at least 6 months, the security forces were not allowed to carry weapons. All they had were their batons and plastic shields. So actually the highest number of casualties was among civilians and security forces. And when I'm talking about civilians, I'm talking about the typical MO of the West, having snipers on roofs, picking off civilians and security forces to create this impression of violence by the incumbent government, which of course was President Assad. And Assad then basically provided a huge number of reforms, and guarantees to try and create a peace, to try and calm everybody down. But of course, this was not a genuine protest, because had it been a genuine protest, then these responses to their demands, all of which were met by President Assad in those early days, would have been enough. But of course, that's not what the West wanted. So then they started to provide more weapons, and Al-Qaeda and ISIS were reinforcing the Muslim Brotherhood factions, which were the Free Syrian Army. Very early on, we saw that Colonel Al-Qaeda, who was Free Syrian Army, was collaborating with ISIS in a number of massacres and occupation of Syrian Arab Army bases and so on. So it was very, very clear from very early on. I remember taking testimonies from the fire brigades in Latakia and Tartus in the early days of the protests. And they were telling me, the peaceful protests, like we never saw people like this on the streets of our towns. Islamists with these beards, and they weren't from Syria. And the fire brigades were completely unarmed. I mean, they were there to keep the peace and to use the water cannon if there were clashes between the supporters of the government and the protesters. But they were getting knifed, they were getting sniped, because there were already guns among the protesters. Then they were getting besieged in their headquarters, so that they couldn't actually get out to try and help people who were getting beaten up by these gangs. And there was one testimony that I took of a mother whose son was in the security forces. He was in the police forces, and he was unarmed. His body was returned to her, cut into pieces in a plastic bag by the protesters. So, this was very early on, and the chants of Alawites to the grave and Christians to Beirut, these kind of sectarian slogans that were being used by these peaceful protesters were very far from peaceful. And of course, then that unleashed a series of sectarian massacres targeting Christians, targeting Alawites, targeting Yazidi, Ismaili, all the ethnic minorities inside Syria, because Syria is secular, but it's incredibly diverse. It's not only Orthodox Christianity, it's Catholicism, it's Presbyterianism, it's evangelical Christian. It's an extraordinary country, and a lot of people don't realize the extent of diversity here. And yet all of that coexistence and diversity was under attack at that point.
So they have some of the churches from 2,000 years old, the caves and monasteries.
Well, they have. I mean, of course, in Damascus is where Saul converted, and they still have the tiny little chapel where allegedly he had his epiphany and converted to Christianity. In the Umayyad mosque, in Damascus, you have the remains of John the Baptist.
Wow.
In Damascus, in most cities here in Syria, you can hear church bells next to the mosque to the azan prayer. And you know, this is always my point. This is what the West is trying to destroy. It's trying to destroy coexistence, because in pre-Zionist Palestine, Jews and Christians and atheists and Muslims lived side by side in a one democratic Palestinian state, which was effectively secular. It wasn't a Muslim state. Syria is not a Muslim state. It's a secular state. But it is over time. I mean, in the old city, there is a Jewish sector, which now, funnily enough, most of the houses were rented out to Palestinian refugees, ironically. No, it's an extraordinary country from that perspective. I think in one of the churches in the Christian Valley, they call it, close to Homs, there's a tiny, I've forgotten the name of it now, there's a tiny church that carries the letter from Prophet Muhammad instructing Muslims to protect Christians.
Wow.
But, you know, this is Syria. This is the beating heart of Syria, is this incredible diversity and coexistence. But I would also say the same about Palestine prior to British mandate and British interference and the Zionist settler project.
So what is your day-to-day life like in Syria? I mean, do you speak the language, the Arabic, or?
Badly. It's a very difficult language. Syrians always tell me, no, it isn't, but it is, trust me.
So you just smile a lot, nod a lot?
No, I mean, I can get by. I can get by, and I can understand more than I can speak. It's improving slowly. But life here is incredibly tough. I mean, you know, they've been under sanctions basically since 2000, but of course, since 2011, they've been increased unbelievably, and they're not really sanctions. They're collective punishment, coercive measures against the Syrian people. In the northeast, of course, all resources are occupied by the United States and their various proxies, which include ISIS and the Kurdish separatists. In the northwest, the same. In fact, Al Qaeda has a monopoly over the processing of the oil that is stolen by the Kurds and the Americans in the northeast. People can check that. The company's name is Watad, WATAD. So there is, there is collaboration. Yeah.
Sorry, I mean, I might have seen something about that in the WikiLeaks emails as well.
Yes, possibly.
About how they were planning to divert the ISIS oil revenue into the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It was really shocking.
Possible. Yeah, it's complete theft. But of course, also what it is, more importantly, is the deprivation for the Syrian people in order to turn them again, or attempt to turn them again against the government. So we have literally no fuel for cars, for generators. We have no electricity. I mean, here I have 4 hours off, 2 hours on, which is pretty good. Most people will only get an hour and a couple of hours per day, particularly in rural areas. Hospitals are struggling because they can't replace equipment and machinery and so on. They can't buy new machinery. They can't get the fuel to maintain the generators when the electricity goes, for example. But it also means
being in the Middle East, surrounded by trillions of dollars of oil reserves, and people don't have oil. What madness!
Well, imagine in Gaza and Palestine. Like there's 1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas off 20 nautical miles off the coastline of Gaza, which was discovered pre-2000, and the Palestinians have never had access to it. It's their oil. And the oil that Israel is selling to Egypt and to countries in the region is Palestinian oil off the coast of the occupied territories. And of course, also there's 122 trillion cubic feet off the Levant coast, so off Syria and Lebanon, which of course they want to get their hands on also.
That's a part of, I mean, the Golan Heights, or that's
No,
different?
that's the East Mediterranean. So that's the coastal area of Latakia and Tartus in Syria, and then in the coast, you've probably heard of the Karish gas station off the coast of Lebanon. There was a kind of a conflict between Hezbollah and Israel over exploration rights a couple of years ago. And so basically, Syria has no access to its resources. And on top of that, it is effectively under siege because the northwest is occupied by Al Qaeda and Turkey, the north by Turkey and the Muslim Brotherhood, the northeast by the United States and the Kurdish separatists and ISIS, the entire eastern border by the US and ISIS, the central desert area where now the Syrian army is waging a war against the ISIS terror cells that have embedded themselves there, of course, with the help of the United States.
My God.
And the south, there's another separatist movement that's being backed by the United States and Israel in particular, led by the Druze separatist factions, which are kind of in the minority among the Druze communities in the south.
So that's near the border of Jordan, or?
Yes, near the border of Jordan and the occupied Golan. Because the Golan territories were taken in 1967 illegally. And of course were annexed by Israel, which provides 30% of the water supply to Israel. So not only oil, but also natural resources that are being stolen from Syria. And, so life here is incredibly hard because inflation is soaring. The food prices are astronomical. Salaries have stayed pretty much the same. To give you an idea, most people are earning about $20 a month.
Wow.
With the current exchange rate. But food is consistently going up because supply is down. Demand is up, supply is down. So there's no real exit from Syria, and there's no entry for humanitarian aid and relief, except for the Al Bukamal crossing, which is in the eastern sector on the border with Iraq, and that's the last remaining open border crossing that's under the control of the Hashd al-Shabi, the Iraqi resistance factions that are affiliated to the Iraq military, and the Syrian Arab Army.
So the recent rapprochement with the Arab League, that kind of stuff has not helped a lot.
Well, the thing is that the Arab League is completely in the sway of the United States generally. I mean, when you look at it, Jordan actually helped the United States and the UK to defend Israel against the Iranian retaliation for the Israeli bombing of the embassy here in Damascus. I mean, two of my friends were grievously injured on that day because they were jogging past the embassy. Many civilians were injured and killed on that day. Jordan, has effectively provided a land bridge to Israel to counter the Ansarullah, the Yemeni blockade of the Red Sea. So has the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the UAE in particular. UAE is already normalized with Israel, as is Egypt. Saudi Arabia is kind of talking about a Palestinian state. But, I don't really put much store into these announcements of a Palestinian state while the genocide is continuing. Because in the occupied territories, for example, I think there's something like 700 new settlements proposed since October the 7th. And we know that the settlements are designed to break up the Palestinian territories further and to occupy more territory. So, for me, it doesn't mean anything if people are talking about a Palestinian state until they stop the genocide, until they end the apartheid and the occupation. It's meaningless for me. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia is talking defense pacts with the United States and so on. So it plays a fairly duplicitous role, as does Turkey. So I think the normalization, as it was described with President Assad, was an admission of defeat because effectively the regime change war failed. And I think this is an attempt to sort of, again, influence President Assad and influence his policies in Syria through the Saudi Arabia influence and potentially also the UAE influence.
Mm. Wow.
That's only my opinion, but I mean, that's how I read what's happening.
So there was some hope that when things calm down, China's Belt and Road Initiative would be able to extend to Syria and will be able to make a big difference in reconstruction and all of that. So how does that prospect look right now?
Well, I mean, as I said, it was no mistake that Israel was created when it was, because this was at the point of the rise of Pan-Arabism and the United Arab Republic, which was Egypt and Syria. And if you look at geographically where Palestine is, it was obvious that they were going to create this settler colonialist project there to divide Egypt and Syria. And to a large degree, it's worked. Because Egypt, as I've talked about, is completely, in a sense, I describe it as the Ukraine of West Asia. It's completely sold out. Most of its technology, its resources, its industry is now owned by foreign interests. It to a large degree, doesn't have its sovereignty anymore. So, that plan to a degree has worked. If you go back to 97 to the clean break doctrine that was actually commissioned by Netanyahu back then, it talks about fracturing the region in order to secure Israel's future, and that Syria was instrumental. Of course, Syria is instrumental. It's the land bridge between Iran, Iraq, and the resistance, right? If Syria had fallen, the resistance wouldn't exist as it is now, without a doubt. Syria is absolutely the hub of the resistance activity in the region, whether it's Iraq. Iraqi resistance is not attacking Israel from Iraqi territory. It's attacking Israel from Syrian territory, right? Many of the resistance factions are operating from inside Syria, which is why, of course, Syria is constantly being targeted by Israel. But coming back to the Belt and Road Initiative, of course, also, if we go back to 2004 and Assad's 4Cs project, which again was bringing the Belt and Road Initiative into this idea of Syria being the trade and the economic hub for the region and being the link between East Asia, West Asia, and Europe. But this was anathema to the West because they wanted control of the region and the resources, and to prevent any kind of Chinese ascendancy or Russian ascendancy or Iranian ascendancy. And so therefore, part of Israel's role is to divert away from the Belt and Road Initiative to the Indian Middle East Economic Corridor, which is from Mumbai through the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, into Israel, and then Egypt, and then to Europe. And Netanyahu's dystopian plans for Gaza is exactly that, to make Gaza a kind of trade-free zone in the middle of all this, and turn it into an industrial zone, which is acting as a link for all of this industry coming from the Gulf states and from India through the region, and turn Israel into the central hub. This suits the West. So, part of what is happening now, part of the genocide, part of the war against Syria, is this war between the two axes. Mm. The rising multipolar axis and the declining unipolar neo-colonialist supremacist axis.
Wow. Okay. So we're running out of time. there's so much to talk about, but there's a little time. Wow. Okay. So, where do you see the Middle East, like, say, 10 years from now? So is there any hope of, peace, prosperity, multipolarity, infrastructure, development?
Of course there is. There's always hope. And I think, I think for me, sorry, there's one of the dogs snoring, if you can hear it on the audio. Our hope living here in the region and living among the people of the region is in the resistance. It's in the armed resistance. It's not in the UN or the ICC or the ICJ or any of these Western captured institutions. I am not belittling, for example, the case that South Africa took, etc. But the fact is, what has it done? It hasn't stopped the genocide, right? What was the instruction for Israel to yet again investigate its crimes against humanity in Gaza that have actually increased since the ICC issued an arrest warrant, since the ICJ, called for them to cease their plausible genocide? It's increased. So what Hezbollah is doing in the northern occupied territories or on the border with the northern occupied territories to divert the Israeli military from Gaza, so the full force of that Israeli military is not totally focused on, I'm sorry, it's very loud here, it's not fully focused on Gaza. But we also know that Israel wants to expand and escalate the war because that's the only way it can survive in the region, is to have some kind of Pyrrhic victory. Right now it's lost in Gaza. After 9 months of pulverizing Gaza, it still hasn't destroyed the resistance, right? Now it's talking about an escalation into Lebanon. And I was talking to Mohammed Marandi a couple of days ago, who believes that this escalation will take place because Israel has nowhere to go but to expand the war. Because it can't retract now. It's in tatters economically, militarily, socially. 200,000 settlers have been driven out of the north. People are leaving Israel because of a lack of security, and they know if it escalates against Hezbollah, that security is going to be shot to pieces, right? Because it won't be only against Hezbollah, it's going to be against Yemen, against Ansarullah, it's going to be against Iranian factions, it's going to be against the Afghan resistance factions, the Iraqi resistance factions, the Syrian resistance factions, the Lebanese resistance factions, besides Hezbollah. But I do think we're facing the potential of escalation and a regional war, but I also think we're facing the decline of those that manage and control and keep Israel on life support. Which is the US and the UK.
What if the US, the empire, goes the way of the Soviet Union? What would the Israelis do?
Well, that's the point. If the US decline accelerates, then Israel and Ukraine, of course, are going to be left high and dry. The EU, to some degree, is waking up to the fact that it's occupied by the US, and there are some glimmers of attempts by formerly EU sovereign nations to try and create, an alliance aside from NATO, which is US controlled. I just think we're entering an age of transformation, but that transformation is going to be bloody. It's not going to be achieved through negotiations because the West has proven it's not interested in negotiations. Look how it's demonized and vilified Orban for going on a peace tour. It's just, it's just insane.
What, like a bad, evil man talking about
Xi Jinping is demonized for trying to broker peace in Ukraine. Everyone who tries to broker peace is vilified. So it's clear they're pushing for an escalation because their entire economies depend on war. So for me, I just don't see how we avoid an escalation, because unless the West is going to suddenly back down and play nice, which it hasn't done throughout its entire existence. So I honestly don't see how it's going to do it now. And Israel will keep going as long as it has that life support from the UK, EU, and US. Mm. So to a degree, you've almost got to cut the head off the snake for the snake to die. And the head of the snake is the US, the UK, and the EU. But I think if the war expands in Lebanon, the US is going to see itself being targeted way more than it has done until now. In the regions that it occupies, like, for example, Iraq and Syria, even to some degree in Turkey.
Mm. Wow. Okay.
Interesting time.
Well, you're doing God's work by staying in Syria, because very few journalists, they get to report from that area. So be safe. And where can people find you, follow you, read you, watch you?
Mostly at my Substack, Patreon, Twitter. I'm still there, although I'm heavily shadow banned. Telegram, and I'm hanging on YouTube again. I'm not quite sure for how long, but those are the main ones.
Okay. We'll put all those the information in the video. Thank you so much, Vanessa.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
Sure. And have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.